How is the communism of today? England has socialist parties, Canada has socialist parties. How is the socialism that you recognize in the Obama administration different from the socialism that exists in these Commonwealth nations? And how is that different from the communist movement from the 50s?
Well, there is no gulag anymore. I think at a certain point, the Soviet Union actually realized it was not the most beneficial for their success, for their continued acceptance in the West, to have a gulag. And this was partly due to many of these truth tellers that I write about in my book, who actually came out even before Solzhenitsyn to tell us what was going on inside the Soviet Union, whereby slave labor was actually the engine of any economic well-being that they may have had. They were depending on millions and millions of people inside the gulag doing this work. In more modern times, I think that the left has learned, because a lot of these things have just seeped into our tissues. There's no longer quite the demarcation that we once would have recognized between communists and other parties. So much we've been co-opted by so much of the communist project, really. But I think that in our time, we see the single person isolated, the single person made an example of, whether it's a Michelle Bachmann in the Congress, where last year she was utterly castigated and demonized for raising questions about Muslim Brotherhood penetration inside the policymaking chain. This shut up everyone else. So in other words, you don't need to take hundreds, thousands of people off to the gulag. What you do is you make an example of an individual, and you essentially smear them out of existence, isolate them, and other people follow suit. And I've heard this from many people, that inside our security agencies, Homeland Security, Pentagon, and so on, people will say, I don't want to be another Michelle Bachmann, I don't want to be another one of, for example, the anti-Islamic so-called trainers, by name Matt Dooley, Stephen Coughlin. I don't want to be isolated, I don't want to lose my job. So gulags are no longer necessary, but the examples are made. The examples are made, and that we are controlled by this, it would seem, very ridiculous name-calling. I mean, that's essentially what it is, but people respond, and they are silenced.
How about the tabooing of questions of the Obama eligibility for office? By creating
I could talk
this
a lot
taboo.
about that.
Would you please?
Yes, I would. I have written, I wouldn't say extensively, but I have written, probably 6, 8, 10 columns in the space of a year's time, exactly about the eligibility issue, about the birth certificate forgery, about court cases that have gone on in courts, for example, in Georgia, in New Jersey, the investigation out in Arizona, the investigation in Hawaii, and I can tell you, my column is distributed to roughly 100 or so papers. I have they call them clients, I have papers that will not run anything I write, no matter how factual it is. They will not write anything on the eligibility issue. And I would say one of the greatest offenders of that is a paper that is now defunct in its daily newspaper form, the Washington Examiner, which is one of my more notable clients. They told me that they would not run a single column about anything having to do with President Obama's eligibility. It wasn't so much that they thought I was wrong or out of bounds with what I was reporting, but they didn't want to be responsible for the editor actually said blood in the streets, which suggests to me that they actually bought into it and yet did not want to see the story taken to its logical conclusion, which would be impeachment, certainly, if these charges were proven, and in this particular man's opinion, blood in the streets. And I said, you know what, I think you're saying that we actually live in a thuggish nation if we cannot have rule of law. Yeah. And you're living in fear if you're afraid of this story. The media is afraid of this story. They will not report it. It is really the crime of the century, the crime of our history in terms of what the implications are. But it is something that everyone runs from.
Should challenging the authenticity of the birth certificate be tabooed and pariahified like Sheriff Joe Arpaio?
Absolutely not. That investigation, the evidence that the Sheriff Joe Arpaio's investigation compiled, should have naturally been taken up by a prosecuting attorney, taken up by the Congress, and examined. Is it true or is it not? If it's not true, fine, we can dispense with it. If these charges, if this forensic evidence is compelling, steps should be taken. This would be fraud on a scale unimaginable.
Yeah.
But there's an abdication of responsibility in the Congress, in the prosecutorial class, in the media, so we have dysfunction in our government.
And finally, as a journalist yourself, how complicit do you feel the mainstream journalists have been in defending this statism policy within this administration?
Well, I think that they're very complicit. I think that they are very often kind of serving almost as a Praetorian guard to the president. They're not interested in following stories, and I don't necessarily think it's always a nefarious plot. It's just their general tendency. It's their reflex. When you go back to the Benghazi scandal as it was unfolding last fall, I remember being so struck by when it actually came out. Now, this would be mainstream media sourcing. I think it was Reuters or CBS was coming out with some of the real-time information that we found out that there was understanding of what was going on, and this was news of the day in terms of Washington understanding that the embassy, the compound was under assault. Right. There was some breaking news at that point. Right. When it was pretty sensational at the moment, and the very next time that the press corps got in front of Jay Carney, the White House spokesman, their first question was something like, this was during the campaign, did President Obama sleep well last night? Yes. What's for dinner? I mean, these were the kinds of questions they asked, and it's just like, it seems to bounce off their brains. And then, of course, there is also the element that is protective of him and does not want to have anything stop the forward motion of the